crackers dissolved in spiced syrup to fake apple pie, mashed potato rolled with peanut butter into candy, cake leavened with vinegar instead of eggs. These were the tricks your grandmother kept when the pantry ran short and sugar was gone. Here are 30 easy Depression-era treats Grandma made that no one makes anymore. Wacky cake went by a lot of names in the 1930s: crazy cake, cockeyed cake, war cake, and none of them were learned from a cookbook. The dry ingredients went straight into the baking pan: flour, sugar, cocoa, salt, baking soda. 3 small wells pressed into the powder with the back of a spoon. 1 for vanilla, 1 for vinegar, 1 for oil. Cold water poured over the top, everything stirred in the pan, slid directly into the oven. No bowl, no mixer, no eggs, no butter, no milk. The vinegar and baking soda fizzed together and lifted the crumb the way eggs never could on a tight budget. What came out was dense, dark, brownie rich, moist in a way that startled people who expected something punishing. Betty Crocker's radio program spread versions during the Depression years, but the women making it had already worked it out on their own. You didn't need to know the chemistry. You just had to know those 3 divots and pour the water last. She started it the night before, always the night before. Raisins into a pot with brown sugar, hot water, lard, cinnamon, and cloves, boiled 3 minutes until the kitchen smelled like a church basement in the best possible way. Then it cooled overnight. By morning, the liquid had thickened and the raisins had swelled fat with spice, and that was when the flour went in. 3 cups, no eggs, no milk, just the raisin mixture and a spoon of baking soda dissolved in warm water. Boiled raisin cake had been called war cake since the First World War, when the United States Food Administration published it in a 1918 pamphlet on conservation sweets. The Depression women didn't need the pamphlet. They already knew. If you had raisins and brown sugar and lard and thyme, you had a cake that kept for weeks in a tin, worth sending to a son stationed far away. The recipe survived. The women who stirred it without measuring are gone. Nobody looked at a boiled russet potato and thought candy. Nobody except the women who knew. The potato had to be cold. That part was non-negotiable. Mash it smooth, work in powdered sugar a cup at a time until you had a stiff dough, roll it thin on a sugared board, spread peanut butter across the surface, roll it up tight like a jelly roll, chill it, slice it. What came out looked like a pastry spiral. Pale dough swirled with brown peanut butter, cut clean into pinwheels. It tasted like peanut butter fudge. It tasted nothing like potato. Potato candy traced to Irish and German immigrant families, spread through Appalachian kitchens by Pennsylvania Dutch settlers, where peanut butter became the standard filling. In Kansas, they used walnuts. In New England, coconut. The filling changed by county. The potato dough never did. No one who didn't already know would have guessed what it was made of. That was the point. Before anyone tasted it, they argued it couldn't be done. Apple pie without apples. 36 Ritz crackers, not crushed but broken rough, went into an unbaked crust with 2 cups of water, sugar, cream of tartar, and a squeeze of lemon. The cream of tartar was the trick. It reacted with the sugar syrup in the oven heat and produced a faintly fruity tang that the brain, primed by cinnamon and the fluted crust, read as apple. Nabisco printed the recipe on Ritz cracker boxes from the 1930s through the early 1990s, 3 generations of American households stretching a pantry into a holiday dessert. People who tried it skeptical came back for seconds. People who grew up on it defended it. People who never heard of it tend to stare at the recipe like it's a conjuring trick. It was. The Depression turned ordinary women into conjurers, and the pantry held more magic than anyone admitted. Peanut butter cost about 10 cents a pound in the 1930s, making it one of the cheapest proteins a family could buy when meat was mostly out of reach. So it went into everything. And it went into bread. Peanut butter bread needed no yeast and no eggs. Flour, baking powder, brown sugar, peanut butter, and milk worked together into a dense, nutty loaf that baked for the better part of an hour. Still warm from the oven, sliced thick with a smear of homemade jam, it felt like a reward rather than a necessity. Your grandmother might have eaten it plain. She might have had butter on hers if there was any. She ate it because it was there and because she had helped make it, standing at the kitchen counter measuring peanut butter in big spoonfuls. That memory, the weight of the spoon, the smell of the oven, stayed with people long after the bread was gone. Nobody bakes it now. Vinegar pie belonged to a category Depression cooks called desperation pies, shells filled with something other than fruit when fruit was gone and money was scarcer. White or cider vinegar, sugar, flour, butter, sometimes an egg if you had one, mixed smooth and poured into an unbaked shell. Baked until set and barely jiggly at the center. What came out was a tart sweet custard with the texture of chess pie, soft and clean and worth a second slice. The vinegar pulled back from its sharpness in the heat and left something that tasted closer to lemon than anything acidic, which was the entire point. Lemon was expensive and sometimes unavailable. Vinegar was always in the house. You never said what was in it before they tasted it. If you did, they put down their fork. If you didn't, they asked for the recipe. The difference between a Depression cook and everyone else was knowing which secrets to keep until after dessert. Water pie sounds like it shouldn't work. The people who made it in the 1930s mostly agreed, but they made it anyway because the alternative was no pie at all. An unbaked shell, 1.5 cups of cold water, a 1/4 cup of flour, a cup of sugar, a few pats of butter, a little vanilla. That was it. The oven did the rest, almost an hour at heat, and then the pie had to chill completely before it would hold a slice. Versions appeared in American newspapers as early as the 1870s, when winter meant hens and cows slowed and eggs and milk grew scarce. The Depression simply returned it to tables that had moved on. What it tasted like was a mild, sweet, buttery custard, not rich, not complicated, but honest in the way only very simple food can be. She made it when there was nothing else, and she made it well. That matters more than most people realize. The recipe showed up on radio programs and in women's periodicals all through the 1930s. Oatmeal cookies made without eggs, milk, or butter. Every household that tried them developed a version within a generation. The base never changed. Rolled oats, shortening, brown sugar, water, vanilla, flour, baking soda. Creamed together, dropped in spoonfuls onto a greased pan, 12 minutes at 350. What came out had a soft interior and crisped edge, and that deep toasty oat flavor that no amount of butter would have improved. Some grandmothers added raisins, some added cinnamon. Some kept them plain because plain was what the children wanted, and the children were what mattered. The tin was always in the same spot on the same shelf. You knew better than to get into it before supper. You got into it anyway. She never said a word because there were always enough. And making sure there were always enough was what knowing this recipe meant. Nobody wrote it down. That was the whole point. If you had to look it up, you weren't ready to make it. Cornstarch pudding was cornstarch and sugar stirred dry in a pot, then boiling water poured in slow while you whisked hard to keep out lumps, held over heat until the mixture thickened and went clear. If there was milk, you used milk and got something closer to a creamy blancmange. If there was no milk, you used water and it still set up smooth and clean and faintly sweet. Vanilla at the end if you had it. Nutmeg on top if you had that. Rita Van Amber documented it in her book on Depression cooking from the 1930s. 3 ingredients, cooked together, served cold. The women who made it called it dessert and meant it. They made it for sick children who needed something gentle. They made it when the pantry was spoken for everywhere else. The spoon scraped the bowl clean every time. But years before the desperation pies reached their peak, American kitchens had already worked out how to bake without eggs by turning to the pantry shelf. Applesauce cake traced back to colonial New England, where the apple harvest came once a year and home cooks stewed and strained it into sauce specifically to stand in for eggs and fat in baked goods meant to keep through winter. A World War I recipe called for no eggs and only 2 tablespoons of butter. Applesauce doing all the binding work. By the Depression years, the recipe had been tested across 2 generations, and the women who made it knew exactly what they were doing. Flour, spices, a little oil, the sauce, dense, moist, kept well in a tin. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, raisins if you had them, walnuts off the backyard tree if you didn't. Boxed spice cake mixes pushed it off the counter in the 1950s, and it quietly stopped appearing. Very few people under 60 know what it actually tastes like. You did not tell people what was in it. That was the first rule. The second was to let them eat a full slice before they asked. Tomato soup cake had been in Campbell's recipe archives since 1922, spreading through Depression kitchens because a 10-cent can of condensed soup replaced the milk, eggs, and fat that bakers couldn't afford. The soup's thickened starch and natural pectin held moisture in the crumb the way proper fat would, and the spices, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, allspice, covered any trace of tomato completely. What came out was a dark, warmly spiced cake that people identified as carrot cake or spice cake and reached for a second slice of before they ever asked. Sylvia Plath baked her mother's version and wrote home from England asking how many ounces were in an American can. The British cans ran larger, and her cake came out too wet. A recipe that crossed oceans, and almost no one recognizes it from the name alone. Saturday night was taffy night in a lot of Depression-era households, and it was entertainment as much as cooking, something to do after supper when there was no money for anything else. Brown sugar, molasses, butter, a splash of vinegar, water, cooked together in a heavy pot until a drop in cold water cracked clean between the fingers. That was the test. Not a thermometer because most kitchens didn't have one. If it cracked, you poured the batch onto a buttered plate and waited. Then you pulled it. 2 people, one end each, stretching and folding and stretching again, working air into the mass until it lightened from dark amber to pale gold and went glossy and stiff. Cut with scissors into pieces. Let it harden. The children got to pull, which meant they got to stay up late on Saturday, which was the actual point of the whole exercise. Nobody needed a recipe because the knowledge lived in the hands. When the hands are gone, the knowledge goes with them. Sugar cream pie, sometimes called Hoosier pie, had no fruit, no chocolate, and no eggs, and it didn't need any of them. The filling was cream, sugar, flour, butter, and nutmeg, poured raw into an unbaked shell and slid into the oven, where the heat transformed it into something dense and trembling at the center, the way only a barely set custard can. You knew it was done when the edges had puffed and the middle still held a slight wobble. Not liquid, not firm, that narrow zone every experienced baker recognized on sight. Indiana claimed it as its own, and the women who made it measured the cream by the color and weight of the pour rather than by any cup. A dust of freshly grated nutmeg went across the top before it went in. You didn't skip the nutmeg. She made it every Thanksgiving and Christmas, and sometimes for no reason, and when she stopped making it, nobody else picked it up. The recipe sits in the box now, ink faded, flour dusted at the edges, waiting for someone who won't come. Nothing stale went to waste in a Depression-era kitchen, and stale bread went into the pudding dish. Slices or cubes soaked in warm milk, sugar, vanilla, cinnamon, and nutmeg, pressed down until the bread had absorbed everything it would take. Then into a moderate oven until the top was set and slightly crisped, and the inside had gone soft and custardy and smelled like something that cost far more than it did. A thin vanilla sauce went over the top, water, sugar, flour, and vanilla cooked together on the stovetop, because the pudding was good alone but better with something warm poured at the table. Church suppers across the rural South and Appalachia served bread pudding by the panful, the kind of dish that appeared whenever a crowd needed feeding on a budget that didn't stretch. It held people. The grandmothers who made it are gone, and the bread pudding they made tasted different from any version you'll find now. Nobody can explain exactly why. If bread pudding fed a crowd without fuss, oatmeal lace cookies were the kind that made people stop mid-conversation and look at what they were holding. Nothing like a regular oatmeal cookie, rolled paper-thin from oats, butter, brown sugar, and a little flour. They spread flat and baked into caramelized wafers barely 1/8 of an inch thick, almost transparent at the edges. They shattered when you bit them and left a faint film of caramel on your fingers. You baked 2 to a sheet because they spread so far, and you had to lift them while still warm. Wait too long and they snapped. a church social staple through the 1930s and 40s, the kind that went on the good plate next to the good china. Snowdrift shortening spread versions through community cookbooks across the country. She made dozens every December, stored between sheets of waxed paper, and rationed them. You were never allowed more than 2 at a time. She knew exactly how many were left. Lazy Daisy cake showed up in so many community cookbooks through the 1930s that food historian Ann Byrne found 7 nearly identical versions in a single collection, all tracing to snowdrift, shortening advertisements, and newspaper columns that women clipped and traded and tucked into recipe boxes for 2 generations. The cake was a simple oatmeal butter cake baked in a square pan. The frosting was the thing. Brown sugar, butter, cream, and shredded coconut spread raw across the warm cake straight from the oven, then slid under the broiler for 30 seconds. Not a minute, never a minute, because it went from golden to scorched in the time it took to look away. What came out was a caramelized coconut crust over a soft oat cake, warm and served straight from the pan. You've probably never had it. Your great-grandmother made it at least twice a month and thought nothing of it. The recipes that felt ordinary to the people who made them are always the hardest ones to get back. Junket custard came in a little cardboard box with a tablet inside, a rennet tablet, the same enzyme used to set cheese, and the instructions said to dissolve it in cold water, warm the milk to exactly 100 degrees, combine them, and do nothing. No oven, no stirring. Just leave it on the counter for 10 minutes and it would set itself into a silky, barely sweet custard that trembled when you moved the bowl. Cursors Hansen's Laboratory, a Danish company, had been selling rennet tablets in the United States since 1886, each box packaged with a recipe. Children were served junket when they were sick because it was gentle. Adults ate it because they liked it, nutmeg on top, or vanilla, or a spoonful of jam, quivering on the spoon like something between silk and water. By the 1970s, Jell-O had taken over and junket had quietly left the pantry. Most people now would have no idea what you meant if you mentioned it. A rennet tablet, in milk, set on the counter for dessert. Prune whip had powerful friends. President Eisenhower called it one of his favorite desserts. Eleanor Roosevelt served it to White House guests as a deliberate act of solidarity with households that couldn't afford anything else. The recipe first appeared in a Pennsylvania newspaper in 1879 and entered the 1918 Fanny Farmer cookbook during the First World War. During the Depression, prunes, cheap, shelf-stable, naturally sweet, could do the work of rationed sugar. Egg whites whipped to stiff peaks, prune puree folded in, a little sugar, served cold from the icebox. What you got was a mousse, airy and dark and faintly fruity, nothing like the ingredient that went into it. Prune growers began marketing the fruit as a health remedy in the 1920s, and the jokes that followed killed the dish. Something that fed depression families and sat on the president's table vanished into punchlines. Nobody makes it now. That's what a bad reputation can do to something genuinely good. The icebox cake was built the night before, its greatest virtue and the hardest thing to teach children who wanted to eat it immediately. Graham crackers layered into a waxed paper-lined loaf pan, then crushed dates, marshmallows cut in quarters, chopped nuts, and a little sugar pressed over them. Then more crackers, more filling, crackers on top, wrapped tight and left in the refrigerator overnight. By morning, the crackers had softened into something between cake and cookie. The marshmallows had melted into the filling, and the whole thing had set into a loaf you could unmold and slice clean. Depression-era newspaper archives document versions from 1930 onward. The Montana Standard, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, no oven, no heat, no skill beyond patience. The morning reveal was the point. You lifted the waxed paper, turned it out onto a plate, called everyone to the table. She always let you do that part. She always acted surprised at how well it turned out. And if the icebox cake was a trick of patience, prune cake was the one nobody saw coming at the holiday table. California prune growers promoted it at the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, a moment of agricultural pride for an industry built on French plum trees Louis Pellier had brought during the gold rush. The cake that spread from those promotions was moist and dark, prune puree working into the crumb the way buttermilk would, tenderizing it, adding sweetness that didn't announce itself. A boiled buttermilk glaze went over the top. Sugar, buttermilk, and baking soda cooked until it foamed and thickened into a thin, glossy sheet across the warm cake. It appeared in cookbooks through the 1960s, a genuine holiday cake that held its own next to any layer cake on the table. Then prune growers decided to market the fruit as a laxative, and the jokes did the rest. It slipped out of circulation without anyone quite deciding to let it go. The first print recipe for chocolate mayonnaise cake appeared in the Oakland Tribune in 1927, and if you were making it in the 1930s, you were not announcing what was in it. Hellmann's parent company, Best Foods, circulated a promotional booklet in the late 1930s that formalized what home bakers had already figured out. Mayonnaise was eggs and oil in one ingredient, replacing both in a chocolate cake batter without changing the flavor and improving the crumb. Denser, more moist, with a tight texture that held for days. Hellmann's put the recipe directly on its jar labels in 1961. By then, it had been in American kitchens for 30 years, passed on index cards between neighbors, and tucked into recipe boxes next to the secrets that worked best when you didn't explain them first. Professional bakers eventually adopted the technique. The home cooks who worked it out in the 1930s didn't get credit for that because they rarely did. Apple Brown Betty was older than the Depression by several generations, a layered baked dessert of spiced apple slices and buttered breadcrumbs feeding American families since at least the 1880s. What brought it back to Depression-era tables was simple. It used stale bread, which every household had, and however many apples could be spared. Crumbs on the bottom of the dish, apples tossed in cinnamon and sugar over them, more crumbs, more apples, a final layer dotted with butter. 45 minutes at 350, and the top crumbs crisped dark while the apple layers below collapsed into something soft and glossy and fragrant. Served warm from the dish, it needed nothing else, though a spoonful of thick cream, if there was cream, was not turned away. She made it in fall when the apples were ripe and in winter with apples from the cellar. She made it until she couldn't, and when she stopped, nobody took it up. Not because it was hard, because nobody thought to. Persimmon pudding was a fall tradition in Indiana, Missouri, and rural Appalachia, and it depended on knowing one thing that no recipe could tell you. You had to wait for frost. The American persimmon, Diospyros virginiana, native to the eastern woodlands, was so astringent before cold weather hit that eating one early left your mouth puckered for an hour. After the first hard frost, the tannins broke down and the small orange fruits went soft and dark and almost date-sweet, concentrated by the cold into something the tree had been building toward all season. You pressed them through a sieve, mixed the pulp with flour, sugar, eggs, butter, and milk, and baked the whole thing dense and dark in a pan. The flavor landed somewhere between molasses and brown sugar and something entirely its own. Women who grew up with the tree knew the smell of the oven when it was right. Women who didn't have the tree didn't have the recipe. Both are harder to find now than they used to be. Rice pudding was Depression cooking at its most honest. Leftover rice from last night's supper, a little cornstarch, whatever milk was in the house, sugar and vanilla, stirred together over medium heat until the mixture thickened around the grains into something creamy and warm and quietly satisfying. Cinnamon on top, raisins folded in if there were any. It cost almost nothing. It wasted nothing. In households that counted every cup of milk and every spoonful of sugar, rice pudding was the dessert that appeared when there was not enough of anything else, but there was still rice. And there was almost always rice. It had been on American tables since well before the Depression, but it fit the 1930s the way the decade needed it to. Patient, plain, filling, and made from what was already there. She made it in the same pot she cooked the rice in, which meant one fewer dish to wash. She thought of things like that. You didn't notice until she wasn't there to think of them anymore. But if rice pudding was the everyday dessert that asked nothing of you, peanut butter pie was the one she made when she meant it. The filling was peanut butter, cream cheese, and whipped cream folded together and chilled in a cracker crust. Never baked, just set in the refrigerator until firm enough to slice. Inspired by Caro corn syrup's peanut pie promotions in the 1940s, it spread through southern kitchens from Virginia to North Carolina before reaching the rest of the country by the 1960s. Rosalind Carter served her version at the White House with a meringue topping. The version you remember probably had no meringue, just a smooth, dense, cold filling that tasted like peanut butter fudge in a shell. She made it for birthdays and homecomings. You could always tell how much she meant it by the fact that she made it at all. It was the kind of dessert she reserved for the people she wanted to stay. The smell of gingerbread reached you before the kitchen did. Molasses and ginger and cloves coming through the walls, the way only lard-based baking carries a smell through a house. Depression-era gingerbread was dense and dark, made with sorghum molasses as the primary sweetener when refined sugar was expensive or rationed, and lard in place of butter because the lard was already rendered from the hog fat put up for winter. It was not a delicate cake. It was a substantial one, something that stayed with you, that felt like ballast. The lemon sauce that went over the top was water, lemon extract or actual lemon juice, a little sugar, and flour cooked thin and poured warm. It cut through the heavy molasses the way a bright note cuts through a low one, not competing, just clarifying. She never served the gingerbread without the sauce. You could not have explained why it mattered until you tried it without, and then you understood. Bananas cost about 10 cents a pound in the 1930s, and banana pudding in its original Depression form was not the custard-layered dish that post-war Southern cookbooks would make famous. It was simpler. Nabisco vanilla wafers, introduced in 1898 and shelf-stable, layered in a dish with sliced bananas and a topping of whipped evaporated milk rather than from-scratch custard, because evaporated milk was cheaper, kept longer, and whipped up well when cold. The layers went in order: wafers, bananas, whipped milk, repeat, and the dish went into the icebox until the wafers softened just enough. The custard version came later, when eggs were more available and the dish had become a Sunday tradition rather than a budget solution. She made the evaporated milk version long after she could have afforded the other one. Because it was the one she knew. Because you cannot replicate a taste that belonged to a kitchen that no longer exists, no matter how good your custard is. What the mashed potato did in a chocolate cake was make it disappear into something better. Cold leftover mash, smooth, no lumps, no butter added, went into the batter alongside cocoa, flour, sugar, and a little oil, and what came out of the oven was denser and moister than any standard chocolate recipe could produce because potato starch holds water the way flour never can. The potato itself tasted like nothing once the chocolate and sugar were in. Women who knew this used it deliberately, the way experienced cooks use every technical advantage at their disposal. Women who didn't know it thought the cake was just unusually good and couldn't figure out why. The cook never explained unless someone asked directly, and even then the answer came with a look. That particular look that meant you'd been given something worth keeping. Nobody makes this cake now. The secret kept too well. Prune pudding was served at the White House. That fact alone should tell you everything about the Depression years and the woman who ran that kitchen. Eleanor Roosevelt had found the recipe through Cornell University's Home Economics Department, which had developed it as part of an effort to demonstrate that nutritious, inexpensive meals could be served anywhere, including to the President of the United States. So she served it to guests on good china. The pudding was simple: prunes stewed soft, mashed or left whole, sweetened lightly, sometimes finished with whipped egg whites to lighten the texture. It asked almost nothing of a kitchen and cost almost nothing to make. The gesture was the point: eating what the country was eating, refusing to pretend the Depression was happening somewhere else. That kind of honesty, the kind that sits at the table with you, has mostly gone from public life. The pudding went with it. Both deserved better. She cooked it in a coffee can. That was the thing people remembered first. Not the pudding itself, but the coffee can sitting in a pot of simmering water on the back of the stove for 2 hours, the lid weighted down with a flat stone. Steamed sweat pudding was a British and New England tradition carried south and west by families who brought their recipes along, adapted to Depression kitchens because beef sweat, the hard fat from around the kidneys, was cheap or free from the butcher, and the coffee can meant you didn't need an oven at a time when running one for hours was a luxury some families couldn't afford. Dried fruit, brown sugar, sweet flour, and spices packed into the can, sealed, steamed until the interior had set into something dense and dark and faintly sweet, with the particular richness that only rendered fat can give a baked good. Christmas meant this pudding on the table. It meant the coffee can coming down from the shelf in November. It meant a kitchen that smelled like cloves and hot steam and something your grandmother's hands had touched. That kitchen doesn't exist anymore. The smell went with her. A single pot of pinto beans could feed a family for 3 days if the woman cooking knew what she was doing, and she always did. Day one was the beans themselves, slow cooked with a ham hock, an onion, and enough water to cover, served over cornbread with raw onion on the side. Day two, she added water and a handful of elbow macaroni, turning leftover beans into a thicker soup that tasted different enough to feel new. Day three, in went a can of tomatoes and a few drop dumplings made from flour, lard, and a splash of milk. 3 nights, 3 textures, 3 flavors, all from one pot of dried beans that cost pennies. The trick was never letting it boil dry and knowing when to add the water. Too early and it thinned out. Too late and the bottom scorched, which meant losing the fond that gave day 3 its depth. You learned it by standing at the stove beside her, watching the bubble rate. The only thing between your family and a 15-degree night was a few inches of mud packed between logs. Chinking was a fall chore as certain as hog killing. You mixed red clay with water, sometimes binding it with straw or animal hair, and pressed it into every gap the wind had widened since summer. Some folks used creek moss. Others swore by clay and wood ash that dried harder than mortar. The old women ran a hand along the wall and felt the draft before you ever saw the crack. Inside, the worst gaps got sealed with strips of newspaper pasted over with flour and water paste, or rags soaked in tallow. A well-chinked cabin held heat from one fireplace in a room large enough for 8. You learned the quality of the work on the first cold night, lying under quilts, listening for the whistle that meant someone missed a spot. The tomato had to be warm from the garden, not the refrigerator, never the store, and sliced thick enough that the juice ran down your wrist when you bit into the sandwich. 2 slices of soft white bread, a heavy spread of mayonnaise, thick rounds of a tomato still holding the heat of the afternoon sun, and enough salt to make the flavor crack open. This was lunch and sometimes supper across the entire American South, a meal so simple that writing it down felt insulting to the people who made it. Hellmann's, first mass-distributed in the 1920s, became the only acceptable brand. Using anything else was grounds for a kitchen argument that could last a whole summer. The sandwich existed only during tomato season. When the last vine died in September, it vanished, and no winter tomato from a grocery store could bring it back. Long before any of those vegetables hit the table, the most radical trick in these kitchens started not at the stove, but in the front yard, with a hollow log, a bucket, and a pile of fireplace ash. Water poured slowly over the ashes and caught in a wooden bucket below produced lye, and that lye transformed dried corn kernels into hominy through a process called nixtamalization, a technique with Cherokee and indigenous roots going back thousands of years. The kernels soaked until their skins slipped off, swelling into something white, tender, and entirely different from the hard yellow corn that went in. What the old cooks could not have known was that this process unlocked niacin trapped inside the corn, a vitamin the body cannot absorb from untreated kernels, and it was the reason mountain families who ate hominy avoided the pellagra that devastated communities further south. The same ash that heated the house also made the soap and freed the nutrition in the grain. Hog killing day started before dawn and did not end until dark, and the centerpiece and the part that determined whether the family ate well for the next 12 months was rendering the lard. 2 cast-iron washpots sat over fires in the yard, and into them went every scrap of fat, cut small and stirred constantly for hours. The fire had to be wild cherry or hickory, kept low and steady. Let it blaze and the lard scorched, and scorched lard was a catastrophe with no replacement until next year's hog. The liquid fat was strained through cloth into 5-gallon tins. It went into biscuits, pie crusts, fried potatoes, and every pot of beans for the coming year. The cooked down chunks left behind, cracklings, were salted and eaten warm by the kids standing around the fire. Nobody stood idle. Men butchered, women rendered, children stirred. The smoke followed you no matter which side of the pot you chose. Sawmill gravy got its name in the lumber camps of the late 1800s, where cooks fed crews of men using nothing but flour, grease, milk, and black pepper in quantities large enough to fill a washtub. The gravy was thick, pale, peppery, and poured over anything that held still: biscuits, toast, cornbread, fried potatoes. You started with a few spoonfuls of bacon drippings in a hot skillet, stirred in flour until it turned golden and smelled like toasted grain, then poured in milk slowly while scraping the bottom of the pan. The whole process took less than 10 minutes and fed a household for pennies. Some cooks called it bulldog gravy, and in the coal camps of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, it showed up at every meal: breakfast, dinner, and supper. Because the mines paid low and the company store charged high. The pepper had to bite. If you couldn't feel the pepper, the gravy wasn't finished. She made it by sound. The sizzle of flour hitting grease told her everything a recipe never could. The women who cooked on wood stoves understood heat the way a pianist understands keys. Every inch of that iron surface ran at a different temperature, and they used all of it at once. Directly over the firebox was the hottest zone, where the skillet sat for frying. 6 inches to the right, the heat dropped enough for a steady simmer. The back corner barely held a warm-up temperature, perfect for keeping gravy from skinning over. Above it all, the warming shelf, a flat ledge near the stovepipe, held plates at serving temperature, kept bread dough rising and dried herbs without scorching them. A woman working one of these stoves in the 1930s was running 4 heat zones simultaneously without a single dial. She adjusted by sliding pots across the surface, opening or closing the damper, and adding a split of hickory when the fire dropped too low. You knew the stove was right when you could hold your hand 6 inches above the surface and count to 3 before pulling away. Before ice boxes, before anyone in the hollow had heard the word Frigidaire, the spring house kept milk sweet and butter firm through the worst heat and the longest cold. A small stone or log shed built over a natural spring, it channeled cold water through shallow wooden troughs where crocks of buttermilk sat half submerged. Butter molds rested on wet stone shelves. In winter, the constant temperature of the spring, around 50 degrees year-round, kept everything from freezing when the outside air dropped below zero. Churning happened faster in there because the cool air helped fat solidify. You knew a family's spring house by its smell: clean water, cold stone, and the faint tang of fresh dairy. The women who tended these buildings understood humidity and airflow without ever naming those concepts. They knew when the water ran too fast or too slow by touching a crock. Most spring houses are gone now, collapsed behind an empty farmhouse, the spring still running underneath. Tomato gravy started the same way sawmill gravy did: bacon drippings in a hot skillet, a spoonful of flour stirred in. But where sawmill gravy reached for milk, tomato gravy reached for the canning jar. Home-canned tomatoes, crushed by hand into the roux, turned the gravy a deep orange red and gave it a sweetness that the pepper-heavy sawmill version never had. A pinch of sugar went in if the tomatoes were too sharp, and the gravy cooked down until it was thick enough to sit on a split biscuit without running off the edges. Across the rural South through the 1940s and 50s, tomato gravy was breakfast, served alongside whatever the kitchen could produce: eggs if the hens were laying, a slice of cured ham if the smokehouse still had one. The color told you what kind of morning it was. Pale gravy meant milk was plentiful. Red gravy meant the cow had gone dry and the tomatoes were filling in. Nobody in those kitchens ever seasoned a skillet on purpose. They just cooked in it, morning, noon, and night, and the iron did the rest. Every pour of grease, every batch of cornbread, Every round of fried okra laid down another thin layer of polymerized fat that turned raw metal into something slicker than any factory coating. The old women knew which skillet was ready for eggs and which one still needed more time. They knew never to use soap, never to let it soak, and never to put it away wet. A good cast iron pan passed from mother to daughter like jewelry, heavier than it looked, black as night, and worth more than anything in the cupboard. Wagner and Griswold foundries produced the best ones through the 1950s, and those old pans are still the ones people fight over at estate sales. The new ones come pre-seasoned from a factory. The old ones came seasoned by a lifetime of somebody's hands. You held the spool of heavy thread steady while she pushed a darning needle straight through each green bean pod, one after another, until the string hung 4 feet long with Kentucky half-runners. Leather breeches, she called them, or shuck beans, depending on which hollow you came from. The practice likely arrived with German settlers from the Palatinate, though Cherokee households had been drying beans on rawhide cord long before Europeans reached these mountains. Hung from the porch rafters or behind the wood stove, the pods shriveled until they looked like tiny pairs of worn-out trousers, brown and wrinkled. Come January, she soaked them overnight, dropped in a chunk of fatback, and simmered for hours. The taste was nothing like fresh beans, deeper, earthier, almost meaty. Some families tucked a dried hot pepper into the storage sack to keep insects out. You can buy the beans and try it yourself, but the flavor is never quite right without her hands on the thread. Leftover pintos never went to waste in a mountain kitchen, not when you could mash them, shape them into patties, and fry them in a hot skillet until the outside turned crisp and the inside stayed soft and warm. Bean cakes were the second life of a pot of soup beans, made the day after the original meal when the beans had thickened overnight in the refrigerator or on the back of the stove. You mashed them with a fork, mixed in a handful of cornmeal or flour to hold them together, and fried them flat in bacon grease. During the Depression, when a 12-cent bag of dried pintos could feed a family for 3 days, bean cakes extended that to 4. The first day was soup beans with cornbread. The second day was bean cakes fried for supper. Nothing wasted, nothing thrown out. Every calorie pulled from that single bag of dried beans. The cornmeal crust gave them a crunch the original beans never had, and that crunch made it feel like a different meal entirely. Hog killing day in the mountains was not a chore. It was an event, and every family within walking distance came to help because the work was enormous and the rules were absolute. Nothing was wasted. The hams and shoulders went to the smokehouse for months of curing over hickory. The leaf lard, fat from around the kidneys, prized above all other fat, was rendered slowly for baking. Intestines were cleaned, scraped, turned inside out, and stuffed with seasoned sausage. The head simmered for hours until the meat was picked from the skull and pressed into head cheese with vinegar and spices. Feet became souse, skin became cracklings, rendered crisp and crumbled into cornbread. The blood in some Scots-Irish mountain families was caught in a pan and cooked into pudding. Bones went into the soup pot and simmered until they gave up everything. One animal, slaughtered in November, fed a family through March. Every October, before the first real cold snap settled into the hollows, someone had to bank the cabin. Banking meant shoveling dirt, mixed with clay if you could get it, up against the bottom logs, packing it halfway up the lowest course. That gap between the ground and the foundation log never sat flush, and wind cut through it all night long. Some households piled earth so many years running that the cabin looked half buried, like it was sinking into the mountain. Inside, the women recharged the chinking between every log, pushing fresh mud into cracks that had dried and crumbled since spring. You could hear the difference on a windy night. A well-banked cabin held warmth like a fist around the stove. A neglected one whistled. Old-timers said you could tell how a family was doing just by looking at the base of their house in November. The sound came first, a sharp hiss when hot bacon grease hit raw greens, and then the smell of vinegar rising in a cloud of steam that filled the kitchen before the plate reached the table. Kilt lettuce, sometimes called killed lettuce, was the Appalachian way of turning raw leaf lettuce into something warm and wilted and dressed all at once. You picked the lettuce fresh from the garden, leaf lettuce, never iceberg, piled it in a bowl, and poured a hot dressing of bacon grease, apple cider vinegar, and a pinch of sugar directly over the raw leaves. The heat wilted them instantly, and you ate it before it cooled, because kilt lettuce that sat too long turned limp and sad. The window between too small and too bitter lasted only a few weeks. You didn't need a calendar. The lettuce told you when it was ready. Every kitchen in the mountains kept a jar of bacon grease next to the stove, and if you grew up in one of those houses, you already know the rules. You never poured it out. You never let it burn. You strained it through cheesecloth or an old piece of flour sack into a tin can or a crockery jar, and it sat there, warm, golden, ready, beside the salt and the cast iron. That jar was the starting point for nearly everything. Cornbread, fried potatoes, wilted greens, gravy, even popcorn on a Saturday night. Store-bought oil cost money nobody had, but the grease came free with breakfast every single morning. One strip of bacon produced enough fat to fry an egg and season a skillet. A month's worth could carry a household through the lean stretches between hog-killing seasons. Your grandmother never called it recycling. She called it common sense. The jar is gone from most kitchens now, and she would not understand why. The cracklings from rendering day were the one thing that made children look forward to hog killing. Salted and warm from the wash pot, they were golden, impossibly crisp, pure pork compressed into small, crunchy bites. But the real magic came the next morning, when a double handful got folded into cornbread batter. Just meal, a little flour, salt, and lard to grease the skillet, and baked in cast iron so hot the edges sizzled on contact. What came out was cracklin' bread, dense and brown, with pockets of melted fat that dissolved against your tongue. Helen Hoggard of Bertie County, born in 1917, said it was the one dish that brought every child to the kitchen without being called twice. You can find cornmeal and you can find cracklings if you ask a butcher. The bread still will not taste the way hers did. There was a time when the last meal of the day cost nothing but a fistful of cold cornbread and whatever buttermilk was left in the jar. Cornbread crumbled into buttermilk, eaten from a glass with a long spoon, was supper for families across Appalachia, the Ozarks, and the rural Deep South from the Depression years straight through the 1970s. The cornbread had to be cold, at least a few hours old, firm enough to hold its shape when the buttermilk hit it. You crumbled it by hand, poured the buttermilk over, and ate it standing at the counter or sitting on the porch in the dark. A full glass cost less than 3 cents in the 1940s. It required no stove, no heat, no preparation beyond the breaking of bread. The people who ate this every night did not call it a recipe. They called it Tuesday. The jar of bacon grease beside the stove was the most important ingredient in the kitchen, and nobody who grew up in these houses ever threw it away. In late summer, when the apple trees bent heavy with fruit, the real work started. Not the picking, but the preserving. She peeled them in one long spiral with a paring knife worn thin from years of use, and the peels went straight into a pot for apple butter. The slices she threaded onto lengths of cotton twine with a darning needle and hung from the ceiling beams or the porch rafters. They dried in the warm air over days, shrinking into leathery rings that lasted through winter. Come January, those dried apples rehydrated with sugar and spices for fried pies, or slow-cooked into filling for a stack cake, or simmered into what mountain families called cooked fruit, their word for applesauce. No dehydrator, no canning equipment, no electricity required, just twine, a knife, and a warm room. The women who did this every fall did it the same way their mothers had, and the ones who remember can close their eyes and be back in that kitchen the moment the smell returns. In the 1920s and 30s, white sugar was a luxury most mountain families saw only at Christmas, if then. What they had was sorghum, a tall cane grass that grew thick in the bottom fields and could be pressed, boiled, and reduced into a dark, heavy syrup for everything from biscuits to gingerbread to glazing a Christmas ham. The stalks were stripped by hand, fed through a mule-driven press, and the pale green juice collected in buckets. Then came hours of boiling in a long, shallow copper pan over wood fire, skimming green foam until the syrup turned thick and amber. African American families in the Appalachian coalfields built their own sorghum traditions, using it as a meat glaze, a baking ingredient, and a candy base. A good season filled enough jars to last October to June. The flavor was nothing like store-bought molasses, warmer, grassier, with a slight bitterness that told you it came from the field and not a factory. Fried potatoes and onions cooked in saved bacon grease was a meal that appeared on tables across the Appalachian South 3 or 4 nights a week. Potatoes sliced thin, a rough chopped onion, and a heavy spoonful of drippings from that jar, all pressed flat in a cast iron skillet and cooked without stirring until the bottom turned golden and crisp. You flipped it in sections, not all at once, and the onions went sweet and dark against the edges of the potatoes. In the 1950s, a 10-pound bag of potatoes cost around 35 cents, and a single bag could stretch across a full week of suppers. The grease was free, saved from breakfast, from Sunday's fatback, from every strip of bacon that ever touched that pan. Nobody measured. You scooped until the skillet looked right. That instinct died with the women who owned those jars. When the lettuce went limp or the carrots turned soft, nobody in a mountain kitchen threw them out. They filled a bowl with cold water, stirred in a teaspoon of salt, and let those tired vegetables sit for about an hour. The cells in the leaves and roots absorbed the water, the walls stiffened back up, and what looked ready for the compost pile came back crisp enough to serve. Household guides in the 1950s documented the trick, and decades later, food scientists confirmed that cold water increases pressure inside plant cell walls, while the salt bolsters the pectin that holds them rigid. The mountain women who used it every week did not need a laboratory. They had watched their own mothers do it. Overnight, soaking could bloat vegetables too far, so the 1-hour window was the sweet spot. Long enough to revive, short enough to keep the texture honest. Nothing left the kitchen until it had given everything it could. All that meat, all that lard, all those jars, none of it mattered without somewhere cold and dark to keep it. The root cellar was the mountain family's underground vault, dug 6 feet deep into a hillside where the temperature held steady year-round. Potatoes went in first, layered between thick beds of straw inside wooden bins, with a fodder shock of cornstalks built over the top to shed rain. Turnips and rutabagas were bedded the same way. Apples sat on separate shelves, never near the potatoes because the ripening gas would sprout them early. Every few weeks through winter, someone went down with a lantern to check for soft rot, to turn the potatoes, to pull anything going bad before it ruined the rest. A good cellar kept a family fed from November to April. A careless one cost half the winter stores to mold and mice. Children sent down to fetch potatoes in the dark remember the smell: cold earth, straw, and the faint sweetness of stored apples. Cornmeal mush was exactly what it sounded like. Cornmeal stirred slowly into boiling water until it thickened into a dense, porridge-like mass. But the real meal came the next morning, when the leftover mush had been poured into a loaf pan and left to set firm in the cold. You sliced it thick, laid the slices in a skillet with hot grease, and fried them until both sides turned golden and crisp, while the center stayed soft and creamy. Cherokee communities had been cooking cornmeal this way long before German-American settlers in the Appalachian foothills adopted the technique, a practice that showed up in household records from Western Virginia and the Carolinas as far back as the 1700s. Topped with sorghum syrup or a drizzle of honey, fried mush was breakfast and supper depending on the household, and the overnight wait was the whole secret. Fresh mush fell apart in the skillet. You had to let the cold do the work. Patience was the ingredient that never made it into the recipe. Wood cost labor and labor cost time, so every fire had to justify itself. The Dutch oven answered that equation better than anything else in the kitchen. One heavy pot, one fire, one meal, meat on the bottom, root vegetables in the middle, dumplings dropped on top in the last 30 minutes. The cast iron held heat so evenly that nothing scorched if you set the damper right, and the tight lid trapped steam that basted the meat while the broth built below. By the time the pot came off the stove, You had protein, starch, vegetables, and gravy, all from a single vessel on a single flame. Some women started it before dawn and let it cook through the morning while they worked the garden. The broth at the bottom was thick with rendered fat and vegetable starch, and it carried forward into the next day as soup or gravy. One fire, one pot, one cleaning. Long before anyone had a working refrigerator in the mountains, families in Mitchell County, North Carolina, were pulling their cabbages in mid-October and flipping them upside down into freshly plowed furrows. They called it holing it up. Dig a row, set each head root side up, turn another furrow of dirt right over the top, and walk away. The frozen ground drew moisture out slowly, and those tough outer leaves became a natural wrapper that kept the inside crisp all winter. When the thaw came, you dug up a head that tasted fresher than anything from a jar. Your grandmother made slaw from it in the dead of January, and that impossible crunch, in a season of soft, mushy canned vegetables, was worth every bit of the October labor. The women who knew how deep to set those heads never wrote a word of it down. But before anything could be stretched or seasoned, someone had to know what was safe to eat from the ground, and poke salad was the test that separated mountain cooks from everyone else. Phytolacca americana, pokeweed, grew wild along fence rows and ditch banks across the Appalachian South, and in early spring the young shoots were one of the first greens available to families who had eaten nothing fresh since autumn. The plant was toxic if handled wrong. You boiled the leaves 3 separate times, draining and replacing the water each round to pull the poison out before the greens were safe to eat. After the 3rd boil, you fried them in bacon grease with salt, and they turned dark, tender, and rich, tasting like a cross between spinach and asparagus. Cherokee and rural Appalachian families had been preparing poke this way for generations, and the knowledge passed by standing at the stove, not from any book. One wrong step, skipping a boil, picking leaves too mature, and the dish could make you sick. You either knew how or you didn't touch it. She brought the pot to a rolling boil on the wood stove, pulled it off the heat, and nestled it into a wooden box packed tight with hay. Then she closed the lid, walked away, and let the trapped heat do the rest. Hours later, the beans or stew inside was cooked through, tender, thickened, still warm, without burning a single additional stick of wood. The hay box, also called the fireless cooker, appeared in rural American kitchens as far back as the 1890s and survived into the 1940s, especially in mountain homes where firewood meant hours of splitting. Some women used old blankets or crumpled newspaper instead of hay, whatever insulated well enough to hold the temperature steady. The method worked for anything that needed long, slow heat: dried beans, porridge, tough cuts of meat. It freed the stove for other tasks and freed the cook for other work. When gas and electric ranges made heat cheap, the hay box vanished. The principle behind it never stopped being brilliant. When winter dragged past Bering and the body felt heavy with months of salt pork and starchy roots, the mountain remedy was sassafras tea, brewed from roots that grew wild on nearly every Appalachian hillside. You dug them in late fall, scrubbed the bark clean, pounded the thick ones, and boiled them until the water turned a deep reddish brown and the kitchen smelled like root beer and warm wood. The Cherokee had used sassafras to cure scurvy in arriving European sailors. It was the first export from the New World, shipped before tobacco. Mountain families drank it as a spring tonic to thin the blood, and it was one of 3 ingredients in the original SSS tonic, along with spicebush and sweet birch, patented by a South Carolina judge in 1857. Kids drank it sweetened with sorghum. Old women took it straight. The saying went, "When the blood is too thick, there is nothing so fine as a sassafras stick." Most people have never tasted real sassafras outside a commercial root beer, and even that flavor is synthetic now. When the nearest ocean was 500 miles away and fresh fish meant a creek full of catfish you didn't have time to catch, canned salmon was the answer. Salmon patties, canned salmon mixed with egg, cracker crumbs, and chopped onion, shaped into rounds and fried in a skillet, showed up on Friday supper tables across Appalachia and the rural South every week for decades. During the 1930s and 40s, a can of pink salmon cost less than 15 cents and provided enough protein to stretch across 2 meals for a family of 4. Coal mining families in West Virginia and eastern Kentucky relied on them because the company store-stocked canned goods but rarely fresh meat. The patties fried best in a well-seasoned cast-iron skillet with enough grease to come halfway up the sides, and you pressed them thin so the edges went crisp while the center stayed moist. The smell of canned salmon frying on a Friday evening was so specific to these kitchens that catching a trace of it decades later could stop you cold in a grocery aisle. These kitchens are gone and the hands that ran them are gone with them. Which one of these lived in your house?